Here we are, late spring. It's an interesting time because there's a lot of sport. Currently you've got the AFL season coming to a head. You have rugby league coming to a head. You just had the World Rugby Union Championships in Australia and New Zealand. You've got the World Athletics titles, and I could go on and on. So let's look at sport, and let's look at the destruction of local sport as a consequence of the corporatisation of sport. Irrespective of whether it's a ball game or something else. If there's a dollar to be made, it will be made. But what's the cost? Now, there is nothing inherently wrong with competition and sport. In a society that's becoming increasingly sedentary, where exercise is becoming a national issue because of the national obesity epidemic, it's important that people have the ability not just to train individually, but to actually be part of a group, a club. Because as human beings, we tend to come together. And sport is one of those ways in which people have, coming from different backgrounds, of all racial and cultural backgrounds, can come together. Now, obviously, physique is important, especially in professional sport, but it's really not a matter of professional sport. Because what we see today is if anybody has any early signs of talent, irrespective of the sport, they are funneled into a system which tends to propagate the current situation where sport has become not the plaything of the people, but the plaything of corporations. Now, the Australian Football League is a little bit different in terms that the great majority of its clubs are not privately owned, unlike the rugby league clubs and the soccer clubs in this country. But the fact is that they control not just the game, but they have an important impact on governments, especially cash-strapped local governments. And as we've seen in Tasmania, well, the Australian Football League has made extraordinary demands of the Tasmanian government in order to acquire a team. You can see the type of influence and power they're able to exercise. Now, regional communities and outer suburban communities have, for decades, relied on their sporting teams to give them some type of sense of identity. And when we see all the talent and all the money and all the resources move to a centralised authority, whether it's the privately owned rugby league clubs or the AFL clubs or the round games clubs or the AFWL, which is basically part of the AFL, we begin to see the damage that it causes, especially among younger people. Not everyone is an elite athlete. Not everyone will become an elite athlete. But everyone has the potential and the ability to participate in sport for its positive attributes. Sports shouldn't just be something we look at, whether it's live or whether it's controlled by a centralised authority which uses its power to force to enhance its profitability. Now obviously we now find ourselves in a situation where local clubs, regional clubs, suburban clubs are dying. They're dying because they don't have the resources. And although some of the sporting codes have talent spotting programs for very young children, the fact is that the majority of people give up playing sport very early in their life because it's directed to a significant degree at finding those elite athletes which then can join these clubs and provide entertainment. And the basis of this entertainment obviously is a monetary basis, whether the clubs are owned by their members or whether they're privately owned by millionaires and billionaires. So as a society we have forgotten how important physical exercise and sport, especially team sport, is. Because what team sport can do, it can actually overcome many of the divisions which exist in society. And if only the elite sporting teams are those which are supported by the public and receive government support at the expense of suburban and regional sporting clubs, then we will find ourselves in the situation we find ourselves in today, where an increasing number of people, as I said before, especially younger people, no longer see sport as some type of community activity. Because there is such little support by governments at the local, state and federal level for suburban and regional teams, irrespective of the code, the fact is that more and more children are now being excluded from sporting clubs or actually training in local sporting clubs because their parents don't have the resources to buy the uniform or pay the club fees. Now obviously if somebody shows talent, that those fees are picked up by the club or talent scouts. But the reality is, for every one person who joins an elite sporting team and makes a profession out of it, makes a living out of it, there will be 10,000 who fall by the wayside. And what we should be looking at is not just supporting professional sporting clubs. To a significant degree, these clubs have been taken over by gambling entities. And that's why we find the federal government is hesitant to intervene in the amount of damage which is done through gambling on sporting events, especially now with the event of virtual betting. So we've come to a situation where we've seen how society is being manipulated in order to watch sport, in order to gamble, in order to watch, in order to empty their pockets, in order to buy the merchandise. Because obviously everybody who watches sport would like their team at the end of the year to be top of the heap. But we have a wider issue. We've seen the removal at the primary and secondary and technical level of funds by state and federal government for sport. Not just for elite athletes, but for the ability of local children, maybe younger adults, to be involved in sport for the positive aspect it can bring about in terms of breaking down divisions in society, at the same time as keeping a younger generation away from the virtual world, keeping them healthy physically, and to some degree assisting that transition from childhood to teenagehood to adulthood. Because sport in its various guises through human history has been something which has created community. It's something which has kept local communities together. What we see as regions' population decrease, we see the fact that local sporting teams which lack funds and resources and people die. Some teams have been around for generations. We've seen teams amalgamating to survive. We see clubhouses closing down. We see the positive aspects which are brought about by a suburban or suburban-based teams and community and regional-based teams and rural-based teams disappear. For far too long, governments, especially at the state and federal level, have bent over backwards and supported corporate sport because of the financial gain that comes to them in taxation as far as gambling revenue is concerned. And in many regards, many state governments are now addicted to sporting gambling revenue. But as I said before, sport is much more than that. And when we see clubs in the AFL or privately owned clubs in rugby league or the round ball, football, soccer and other clubs relying on gambling revenue to survive, and the problems that creates in the community, we realise we have an issue. And when we see suburban and regional teams folding because of a lack of resources and government support, we have an issue. And when we see more and more children at the primary and secondary level not participating in sport, not physically participating in sport because of the lack of resources which are available to many schools to pursue programs which incorporate the younger generation into physical activity, not for the sake of physical activity, but physical activity which creates bonds, and in many regards lifelong bonds which are created through team sports, which help to break down divisions, whether it's gender, whether it's sexual orientation, whether it's race, whether it's culture, whether it's language. So we have a huge issue. It's about time that these sporting corporations, which have a stranglehold on sport in this country, paid their fair share to regional and suburban teams. There should be legislation in place which forces these clubs to give at least 30 to 40% of their takings, not their profits, but their takings, to be divided among suburban and regional sporting teams, not just to create some type of pathway for children with talent to join elite sporting groups, but to create pathways for a whole variety of younger Australians to participate and benefit not just from the physical activity, but as I said before, benefit from the interaction. In a world where the difference between reality and the virtual world is rapidly shrinking, in a world where young people's lives are dominated by screens, in a world where we are seeing the physical and mental issues created through that almost total concerns regarding the virtual world, we now reach a situation where we need to turn away from the corporate sporting world and demand, one, that sport is freely available at the elite level to everybody, not just those people who have the resources to pay for the rights to see it. And although there is some government legislation, it doesn't go far enough. We need to demand that these elite sporting codes provide 20, 30, 40% of their turnover to suburban, regional and local clubs to ensure their viability. We need to see governments place a greater emphasis on creating the environment via which sporting groups can be developed at the suburban and regional level. Currently, we are in a situation where the great majority of people are suffering because of the centralisation of sport into a corporate entity. And every time we fork out money to buy a ticket to an elite sporting contest, every time we buy their merchandise, we inadvertently support them at the expense of school-based sporting teams, at the expense of regional and rural sporting teams, at the expense of society as a whole.